Thank you, Green Left, for inviting me to speak in this forum. And I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you live and to take part in the discussion. Instead, I've had to record my speech, which I have titled From Lausanne to Zangezur, in the crosshairs of imperialism. For most of the news media, America and Israel's war on Iran has become last month's story. But this is a story that is far from over, and it also has many prequels. What I want to do today is give a quick run-through of the history to date. Like other conflicts and wars in the region, Iran's troubled relations with the United States and Israel, and also with the Iranian Kurds, have their roots in the poisonous soil of European imperialism. The border between Rojhelat, eastern or Iranian Kurdistan, and the other parts of Kurdistan has hardly changed since the 17th century, but the division of the rest of Kurdistan by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne and the treaty's failure to recognise a Kurdish state weakened the position of Kurds everywhere. While Lausanne followed the imperial conflict that we know as the First World War, the Second World War, in many ways a continuation of the first, was followed by the creation of Israel and the international recognition of the Zionist settler colonial project. The First World War helped catalyse the Russian Revolution and the subsequent global competition between the forces of communism and capitalist imperialism. The Second World War allowed this to transform into the Cold War between the East and West. In both these periods, as still today, an overriding mission of Western governments has been the crushing of any emergence of communism or even socialism. Their geographical separation from the Second World War and relatively late entry into the conflict gave the United States economic, political and military dominance and enabled the growth of America's military-industrial complex, whose power President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address in 1961. This power has been used to intervene in other countries to prevent the emergence of left forces and unseat governments out of line with American capitalist interests. During the 19th century, Iran fell under increasing economic dominance by European imperial powers. Iran's leaders gave away economic concessions in exchange for short-term gains. And early last century, the British Anglo-Persian Oil Company took control of the oil fields of southwest Iran. In 1953, it was Iran's turn to undergo a CIA regime change, in this case a joint operation organised by America and the old imperial power Britain. The Iranian parliament had voted to nationalise the oil industry, a challenge to Western commercial interests that was deemed intolerable. The Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was removed in a coup, and power was consolidated under the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had first been put in control by the UK and Russia during the war when his father had refused to let the Allies use the Trans-Iranian Railway. The Shah maintained his rule through his notorious secret police, the Savak, but by the 1970s, economic hardship and inequality were becoming increasingly unbearable. In 1978-9, a mass movement strengthened by workers, especially oil workers, crippled the country and forced the Shah to flee. Support for the left was surging, and workers' strike committees were creating kernels of alternative organisation when Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in France. Khomeini was able to appeal to the more conservative elements, especially small businessmen and the rural or recently rural poor, while neutralising potential opposition through superficially progressive rhetoric. One by one, Khomeini crushed those opposing him: secular leftists, Islamic leftists, women, groups seeking national autonomy. He had no hesitation in carrying out mass assassinations in order to impose his version of Islamic rule, and impose himself as supreme leader. He was able to do this because he initially had the West's backing as a safe anti-left alternative, and because many of the left party leaders failed to understand the threat he posed, casting him as a progressive bourgeois whom they should work with rather than oppose. In November 1979, Iranian student activists took over the US embassy in Tehran, taking 66 Americans hostage and demanding the extradition of the Shah, who had gone to America for cancer treatment. 52 of the hostages were not released until January 1981. Khomeini supported the hostage-taking, calling America the Great Satan, and in 1980 the US cut diplomatic ties with Iran. US sanctions against Iran were brought in response to the hostage-taking and were subsequently increased several times, with drastic impacts on people's living standards. During the 1980s, the US gave support to Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, and in 1984, President Reagan designated Iran as a state sponsor of terror, following attacks on the US military in Lebanon by the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. With America's war against terror following 9/11, President George Bush declared Iran to be part of an axis of evil alongside Iraq and North Korea. Meanwhile, fears that Iran was developing nuclear weapons led to more sanctions by the US, EU, and UN. In 2015, Iran agreed to a deal whereby they would limit nuclear development and submit to regular inspections in exchange for the lifting of these sanctions. However, in 2018, President Trump pulled out of the agreement and reinstated sanctions. In the early summer of 2019, explosions blamed on Iran hit oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, and Iran shot down a US drone. The next year, America assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, head of Iran's elite Quds force. Under the Shah, relations between Iran and Israel had been good, reflecting shared alignment with the United States and against pan-Arabism. Israelis helped develop Iran's military and secret service. Relations changed with the revolution, when Khomeini declared Israel an enemy of Islam and handed the Israeli embassy to the PLO, though the Iran-Iraq war forced Iran to continue to rely on buying Israeli weapons for some years. The Islamic Republic's support for the Palestinians was both ideological as fellow Muslims and strategic. They wanted to win support as defenders of Islam and to distract attention from continued economic hardship. After Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, a time when 11 members of the PKK died fighting alongside the PLO with whom they'd been training, Iran helped organize Lebanese Shia and create Hezbollah. The end of the Cold War and the defeat of Iraq in the Gulf War left Iran and Israel competing for regional dominance under the United States, the one remaining superpower. Kurds, who make up 12 to 15% of Iran's population, suffered under the ethnic nationalism of the Shah and were active in the revolution. They fought for autonomy, not to replace one autocratic, centralized regime with another, and the Kurdish provinces held out the longest against Khomeini's Islamic Republic. The Kurdish resistance was largely led by the leftist Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, the KDPI, and also Komala, the Society of the Revolutionary Toilers of Iranian Kurdistan. In August 1980, Khomeini declared a jihad against the infidel Kurds, so licensing extreme brutality by the regime's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. By the end of 1981, Kurdish resistance was largely defeated, with small-scale fighting continuing into 1983. Kurdish struggles for rights and freedom have become entangled in rivalries between regional powers, exploiting these divisions and being exploited by them. In the Iran-Iraq war, support given to Iran by Kurds persecuted by the Iraqi government helped bring the full wrath of Saddam Hussein down on the Iraqi Kurdish towns and villages, including Halabja, where Saddam's military massacred 5,000 people in a chemical attack. Palestinian reverence for Saddam as a supporter of their cause has undoubtedly complicated relations with the Kurds. The Islamic Republic proved to be every bit as racist towards non-Persians as the Shah had been, as well as prejudiced against Sunnis, which most Kurds are. Rather than attempt to win Kurdish support, the government has kept control over the Kurdish regions through economic deprivation and massive and pervasive securitization. Overt political opposition of any kind is impossible in Iran, where even campaigning on ecological issues can land you in prison, and the remnants of the KDPI and Komala moved across the border with their families to refugee camps in Iraq. The Kurdistan Free Life Party, PJAK, was founded in 2004 to propagate the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan in Rojhelat, but Öcalan's influence there was already strong, as demonstrated by the mass protests at the time of his capture in 1999. PJAK guerrillas are based in the border mountains. Iran under the mullahs has seen several waves of mass protest, each put down with extreme violence. People protest against the lack of freedoms and also against poor economic conditions and lack of vital services. In 2019, anti-government uprisings were taking place in over 2/3 of Iranian provinces when the government unleashed their security forces, leaving 1,500 people dead. Between then and the 2022 protests that were triggered by the government killing of Jinnah Amini for a misarranged headscarf, there were mass strikes by groups struggling to survive on starvation wages and pensions, and protests by farmers unable to get the water needed for their crops, as well as protests for women's rights. There have been more protests about lack of clean water recently. The Iranian regime demands the total subservience of women, and it also takes every opportunity to oppress its Kurdish minority. Of the many communities that make up the population of Iran, Kurds have been left with the least to lose, and despite strong patriarchal tribal traditions, many Iranian Kurds have also been exposed to the Kurdish freedom movement and its focus on women's freedom. The protests, which developed into an uprising, were especially strong in Kurdish areas and also among the Baluch minority at the other end of the country. And the Kurdish movement's slogan of Jin Jian Azadi, Women, Life, Freedom, became the call of the resistance, alongside anti-regime slogans such as Death to the Dictator. People rose up in resistance in every province, and there was tremendous support among students. But out with the Kurdish regions, the uprising failed to achieve the mass mobilization of workers needed to stop the functioning of the economy and bring down the government. The tight grip of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps on every aspect of life has made this much harder to achieve than it was in 1979. And reports of brave and inspiring resistance began to be overtaken by accounts of brutal and sadistic state violence. Last September, 2 years on from the uprising, Amnesty International reported that people in Iran continue to endure the devastating consequences of the authorities' brutal crackdown, and that the authorities have also further escalated their assault on human rights, waging a war on women and girls. Hengor Organization for Human Rights reported that 143 Kurds lost their lives in the uprising. Although the Iranian Kurdish parties outlawed in Iraq did not intervene practically, they were attacked by Iranian missiles and drones, and under Iranian pressure, Iraq has forced them to disarm and relocate away from the border. This has not impacted PJAK, whose guerrilla bases are hidden in the mountains. This last year has seen seismic changes in the political balance in the Middle East, with Israel, armed and backed by the United States and their Western friends, gaining hegemonic power over an increasing area at the expense of Iran and also of Russia. Besides their genocidal attack on Gaza and Iran-backed Hamas, Israel crippled Hezbollah. This seriously weakened the Iranian presence in Syria, and, with Russia, President Assad's other backer, distracted by war in Ukraine, Ahmed al-Sharaa and his Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, was able to take control in Damascus. There is evidence that the UK and the US supported this takeover, and they've been quick to rebrand al-Sharaa from terrorist to welcomed head of state. Israel took advantage of the change of regime in Syria to bomb the country's military bases and ensure that they will never be able to challenge Israeli dominance. For many years, Israel has carried out limited attacks against Iran, including assassinations and sabotage, often targeting their nuclear program. Now, with Iran's regional allies, Hamas, Hezbollah and Assad, weakened or vanquished, the Zionist state is determined to consolidate their dominance. On the 13th of June, they launched their well-prepared attack, which included the assassination of 30 generals and 9 nuclear scientists, as well as attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities and military resources. This was framed as preventing the imminent development of an Iranian nuclear bomb. But Israel has been making the same claim that Iran is on the threshold of achieving a bomb for over a decade. At the time the attack took place, the United States was attempting to negotiate a new deal that would restrict and monitor Iran's nuclear developments in exchange for lifting sanctions. As Israel had planned, the United States stopped their negotiations and followed Israel with an attack of their own, employing weapons that could penetrate Iran's underground facilities, which Israel didn't have the means to do themselves. It is thought that Israel hoped to draw the United States into a full regime change war, but the US made clear that their intervention was a one-off, at least for the time being. For the Iranian Kurds, this 12-day war brought brief hopes that they might be able to use the chaos to build democratic autonomy, as in Syria, alongside fears that, like other attempts at regime change from outside, this would end in years of violence and instability. PJAK explained that what was happening was a war of power and conflicting interests, not a war of liberation for peoples and nations. More immediate concerns that the Iranian regime would take out their anger on their own minorities and political opponents proved well-founded. A month after the ceasefire, Hengor reported that since the beginning of the war, at least 1,800 people had been arrested, 500 of them Kurds, and that most had been accused of espionage for Israel. While Israel clearly has many spies in Iran, there is no reason to believe that these are the people being arrested, as this is used as a convenient charge for destroying government opponents. 6 people, including 3 Kurds, have already been executed for espionage. At least 29 civilians were killed by government forces during checkpoint raids, and there's been increased pressure on political prisoners, heavy sentences including death for political activists, and increasing use of the death penalty more generally. Israel's attack was the result of years of planning and demonstrated how deeply Mossad had infiltrated into Iran. However, it is unclear how much damage has been done to Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon, and it can be argued that they now have a much stronger incentive to do so. Israel was shocked by the extent of the Iranian response and the real damage they managed to inflict in Tel Aviv. But even after agreeing a ceasefire, Israel made clear that, as in Lebanon, they have no intention of abiding by this and will cut Iran down to size whenever they want. Their defense minister stated, "I've instructed the IDF to prepare an enforcement plan against Iran, which includes maintaining Israel's air superiority, preventing the advancement of nuclear capabilities and missile production, and responding to Iran's support for terrorist activities against the State of Israel." Trump stated just this week that if Iran rebuilds their nuclear facilities, "We'll wipe it out faster than you can wave your finger at it. We'll have to do that. We will do that openly and gladly." Meanwhile, plans for a Zangezur corridor could provide a trigger for new conflict in the region. This corridor would link pro-Israel Azerbaijan to Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan exclave and hence Turkey through a slice of Armenian territory along the border with Iran. Washington has now proposed that the United States should build and manage it. But what is seen as an east-west link by Azerbaijan and Turkey is regarded as a barrier to north-south trade by Iran and Russia, and Iran has moved their forces to the border. There is no end in sight for further fighting, both across Iran's borders and internally. On the 19th of July, an Iranian drone killed a PJAK fighter in Iraq. PJAK retaliated by killing 3 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Meanwhile, alongside the continuing crackdown, Kurds in Iran have been mourning the deaths of 3 environmental activists who died fighting wildfires because the Iranian government has no interest in stopping fires destroying Kurdish lands.
I also like to acknowledge the land we are meeting on today. These lands always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also like to emphasize that as a Kurdish background, as you've seen on the map as well, Kurdistan, our homeland is occupied by 4 countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And our countries and our country in those countries occupied have never been acknowledged till day in Parliament. When you speak in Kurdish, especially in northern Kurdistan in Turkey, you're straight away silenced. In Iran, you're hung. In Syria, you're killed. And in Iraq, same situation. So we understand our First Nation people, our aunties and our brothers and sisters, that we will acknowledge their land, acknowledge their struggle, despite whoever says on the news or whichever party says that. We will always acknowledge Aboriginal land and we'll carry on their struggle and be with them. So thank you to Rojava, Solidarity, the Resistance and the Socialist Alliance and the Green Left Weekly and Peter and everyone here for coming and organising. I also like to acknowledge the Kurdish community here as well. We have Kurdish members and we have our Kurdish co-chair Gulay Brusk and our former Kurdish member and current Inner West councillor for Greens, Ismet Hashtan. I'd like to thank all our comrades here as well. So today we are here to discuss about the conflict that's going on between Israel and Iran, but there's also another perspective. What about other people in Iran? Because Iran is not just the land of the Persians. You have Kurds in there, you got Baluchis in there, you got the Laws in there, you got the Azeris in there. You also have refugees from other neighboring countries who call Iran home as well. But I came to this quote: another person's conflict is another person's freedom. When we looked on the news that day when Israel had bombed and killed the commanders and the regime members, we had this sense of, do we be happy? Do we be excited? Do we be sad? Because those commanders, and one of our co-chair Brusk is from Rojhelat, Iran as well. He could, when the question time happened, he could probably share his experience as well. Kurds in Rojhelat have been through so much because of those commanders. Women have been raped, women have been murdered, people have been killed, still being tortured, families have no contact, forced to flee their land and their homeland, leaving their parents, unable to see their parents, unable to go and see their parents' graveyard. Now, when you see these commanders who create these murders against you and your people and your family, and you see them dead, now, do you celebrate that, or do you get worried they could lead to a further conflict? And this is where the Kurdish struggle comes in. Because the Kurdish struggle, as mentioned, PJAK and other political parties, we don't believe in a war. We don't believe in fighting between two nations or two states. We believe in a democratic transition. Yes, we believe that people have the right for armed struggle, but that armed struggle should be the last choice. This is why when Israel and Iran conflict going on, PJAK and the Kurdish political parties have mentioned that this is not the correct way, because this will lead to further escalations. Just like Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish leader, his philosophy is that always create a third option, a democratic solution, a representation, a system where all people are represented. When you're carrying that struggle, or when you're having that system change, a system change should not include just one people. It should include all diversities, all sexualities, all religion, and all minorities and ethnic groups. So when the Kurdish struggle has put forward this motion, we are saying that in case of any Iranian change or regime change, we believe that there's a saying, when you're running from rain, we don't want to be caught up in hail. Just as mentioned there, Shah. We're not saying that Shah was any better than this regime. We're not saying this regime is any better than Shah. They're both worse than one another, and history says it, and people who've lived it also mention it. We believe in a parliamentary system where the people elect, where all representations are included, just like in the, Peter obviously will probably mention as well, the Rojava system, where a council is formed and everyone has a representation, and you grow and you build on that that nation and the rule together. We don't believe in one political party. We don't believe in just one president. In the Kurdish system, in the Kurdish struggle, we believe in co-chair system, where one male and one female is elected. You have a committee members, confederalism we call it, and this is why we always push forward. And happy to also have more discussion and questions. I don't want to bore you all with just me talking, but just wanted to mention that this isn't just a conflict between two nations. There are other people involved in this, and it's good to have panels like this to hear the voices of Kurds, to hear the voices of Baluchis, hear the voices of other minorities and ethnic groups. And I thank you all for actually listening and taking interest in this, because as we know, the media doesn't speak about this. The media doesn't provide platform for ethnic groups like us or third voices like us. Unfortunately, when we try to have protests or when we try to have our own seminars, we don't get the support that we expect, but that's okay, and we know how it works. And no matter, even if there's one person continuing that struggle, we will continue it, and we will go through our agenda, and our agenda is a democratic change, a peaceful change where all people are represented. And I think we should mention this as well, Mr. Öcalan's philosophy of Jinjian Azadi, woman, life, freedom. And wherever we are, we will mention his philosophy, mention that struggle, and I'll pass it on to Peter.
Thanks, Baran. And I also like to acknowledge that we are speaking here on the land of the Gadigal people, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Also acknowledge the presence here of leading members of the Kurdish community, and I hope they will be able to share with us their direct experiences. What I want to contribute in this short presentation is some thoughts about why I believe it's very important for us, even though Australia might seem to be a long, long way away from Kurdistan, for us to pay very careful attention to what's going on there. You know, the famous Russian revolutionary Lenin once explained that in order for a revolutionary situation to develop, for a revolution to take place, it's not enough that the lower classes, that the oppressed classes, don't want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes, the ruling classes, are unable to rule in the old way. So this famous statement about the preconditions for revolution, I think are quite well known. But if you think about it, and you think about the world that we are all living through today, let alone history for the period before we lived, you will see that there have been many parts in the world, primarily, of course, in the global south, where these two conditions have been there. Revolutionary situations have emerged. The people who are oppressed can no longer tolerate their oppression, and the people who are oppressing them can no longer rule in the old way. However, while there have been so many popular uprisings and revolutions, not least in the Middle East during the so-called Arab Spring, most of them have been defeated, or at best produced only a change on the top. One set of oppressors replaced by another set of oppressors, and not make the lives of the majority of people any better. And one of the very few freedom movements that have been successful, not only in rising up, in seizing power, but holding on to it amidst the big upheavals, twice in the last 3 decades, has been the Kurdish liberation movement. It's worth thinking about it. So many revolutionary conditions around the world, most of them have come to nothing, at least in the last 3 decades. You think, not many. You know, there was the Chavez uprising in Latin America. There was a few promising things that happened there, but few have reached the point that the Kurdish freedom movement has reached. First of all, in Iraq in the 1990s, the autonomous region was developed by Peshmerga, liberation fighters, who took advantage of the war and the weakening and toppling of Saddam Hussein to assert their autonomy. And then in the 2012 Rojava revolution in north and east Syria. Now perhaps the Kurdish Regional Council in Iraq could be described more as a change at the top, because it is run by a clique of corrupt business warlords, really. And so, you know, you could say that fits into that category. But the situation in Rojava was very different. A much deeper upheaval, a much deeper overturning of the relations of power in that society. The first indication of this is the empowerment of women in Rojava. In a region that has suffered the brunt of a kind of revival of patriarchal rule, religious and ethnic division, all driven by Islamic fundamentalist movements in the last period, we have here this revolutionary empowerment of women, something that really stands out as a powerful countercurrent and counterexample. As Baran's explained, all leadership positions in the Rojava Democratic Confederalist system have to be shared by a woman and a man, all along. And women are empowered, given the spaces and the power and the legal rights to stand up against oppression, whether it's within their family, from their own husband or their father or whatever, or in broader society. And autonomous women's armed units have not only been formed, but have played a major role in the winning of that revolution and its continued defense. That's been very much the image of the Rojava Revolution, is the woman freedom fighter, the Kurdish woman freedom fighter. And I think it's been an inspiration for many people all around the world. Equally dramatic, I think, is the fact that the democratic confederalism, which is a kind of a system of democracy put into practice by the Rojava Revolution, appears to have succeeded in doing something quite extraordinary, uniting previously antagonistic ethnic and religious groups in the region. Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Armenians, people of different religions, Muslims, Christians, Yazidi. They are all working together within a structure of democratic confederalism running the society, but also united in defending that revolution through the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. often is referred to as the Kurds, but has been pointed out in recent discussions. The SDF is not just only Kurds. There are Arab fighters in there as well. There are fighters from all the minority groups who are taking part in defending the revolution to the SDF. A third proof, I think, of the deeper character of the transformation in Rojava is the rise of cooperatives and collective ownership and control of the economy. By 2015, 3/4 of the critical economic assets of Rojava were under collective control, according to Rojava's Ministry of Economics. Now, a fourth feature of the revolution, which is also enshrined in the autonomous region's constitution, is a commitment to ecology or ecological sustainability. However, because of the ongoing attacks from Turkey and its allied Islamic fundamentalist jihadist militia groups, and even after the revolution substantially defeated ISIS, that actually had a large part of Syria under its control for years, means that progress on this front is difficult. The economy, for instance, is highly dependent on oil extraction and export. Very hard to get around that limitation. So, on one hand, you could say the ecological side is aspirational, and there's nothing wrong with having an aspiration to ecological sustainability. But I would say the collective and cooperative character of the economy in Rojava offers more potential and more promise for the future for attaining or going towards greater ecological sustainability than what we see in the West, where the dictates of big corporations and their profits is completely reversing even the limited steps that have been taken to address climate change, the climate crisis. So even if we say we kind of do like a scorecard, and you say you give them 3 out of 4, 3 out of 4 against the values put forward by the revolution itself, which is not values put forward by other countries, not even Australia. They love to talk about Australian values, but I wish I could see those same values, as the 4 aspirations in Australian values, instead of the fake stuff that we've got that seems to put us with common values with Donald Trump. I don't know about that. Well, I would argue that another reason why this revolution is so important is not only these 4 things are good things. That's easy to see. They're good. Unity between all the different ethnic and religious groups, that's a good thing. Empowerment of women, that's a good thing, right? Ecological sustainability, that's a good thing. Peace, that's a damn good thing. And you can measure this by the number of displaced people and refugees that have fled and sought protection in Rojava. That's real. They're running away from war and division and oppression, and they run to revolution. That's one damn good proof that it's doing something right? It's not only that these are good things, but because the Rojava revolution has proved that these are not just things that we would like to see, but that it can be done. And that's no small thing. Because the world is full of good people, including all the people in this room. We all want the good stuff. We all have good aspirations for a better world, for more democracy, end to conflict, for equality of all, and ecological sustainability. They're things that we want. But proving that it can be done in practice is an even more important thing than wanting it. So Iran, like Syria, Turkey, Iraq, has a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population. As Baran has said, and as Sarah said in a presentation, Iran is a multi-ethnic state. The Persians, I believe, they're no more than 50% of the population, maybe less even, I don't know. If you add up all the other groups, the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Azizis, they comprise nearly 50% of the population. Yet this one group has dominated. And since 1979, not only has been Persian domination and oppression of the other ethnic groups, but there's been religious domination and religious autocracy and persecution of other religious groups. So it is not surprising also that the Kurds in Iran, a long oppressed minority, along with the Baluchis and others, have been not only the ones who've suffered the most, but they're the ones who have been the most rebellious. And there are many histories that maybe Bruce and others can share. I mean, interesting thing for me looking at history with Iran, and to be honest, as a person from another part of the world, in Australia, in the 1970s, I first learned about the Kurdish question because of what the Kurds were suffering and what the Kurds were doing in Iran. Somebody sent me a long article, and I read it. I was living in Perth at the time. I never had heard of the Kurds before. And this article was a very good article. It explained many things that, only now I think more people are finding out about it. Okay, so before I conclude my remarks, I want to go back to something else that the revolutionary Lenin said. So apart from his definition of a revolutionary situation as being one where the lower classes, the oppressed classes, do not want to live in the old way, and the ruling classes are unable to rule in the old way, he later on added that there was a third precondition, not for a revolutionary situation, but for the success of a revolution. And I think it's worth thinking about this when we think of the significance of the Kurdish freedom movement. He added the third precondition for the success of a revolution was the high political activity of the working masses and their readiness for revolutionary action. Now, I would argue that the reason why the Kurds were able not only to rise up 13 years ago in Rojava and North and East Syria, but also hold on to popular power, defend that popular power, and radically transform the power relations in society was because of their years and years of preparation and organization from the base up. Their readiness to achieve autonomy was not just a political will to declare autonomy from the former Assad dictatorship, but actual organized readiness at the base to assert and implement autonomous rule. They were ready for it. They already were organized to assert that autonomy. And I think the Iranian revolutionary movement, at least the section that follows this approach, which is, as you heard from both Sarah and Baran, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, PJAK. I think we'll all hear more about PJAK in the future, which, like the Rojava revolutionaries, is inspired by the theories of this approach put forward by Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, who has been imprisoned by the Turkish state since 1991. This theory that Öcalan put forward was an attempt to break from the dead end, the political dead end, the revolutionary dead end of official bureaucratic dictatorial communism, justified, sadly, and falsely, in my opinion, as Marxism-Leninism. It was that particular left's movement attempt to break from what has been called by other people Stalinism, whatever it is, real existing socialism. There's 100 descriptions for this thing. I think all around the world, at least in our experience, in my experience, any revolutionary movement that still exists today that really is trying to transform things in the right direction has had to reconcile with this past and make their own break from it. And there have been a variety of breaks. And in the Kurdish community, Abdullah Öcalan was the leading figure who had to lead the transformation of that movement, which started off as a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary movement, away from the old ideas that were holding them back. I think, of course, in truth, although as a materialist it's a funny thing to say, that Lenin would turn in his grave. Since he's dead, he can't do that. And so much of it was done in his name and also in the name of Marx over the last century. But revolution, Lenin understood, was not an abstraction, but rather rooted in reality and actual revolutionary practice. So it is in that spirit, whatever you may think about the Kurdish freedom movement's revolutionary theory, it's the concrete reality and its concrete actual revolutionary practice and example that what the whole world needs to study and learn for. And this is why I think we need to pay attention, particularly in this moment of huge crisis, and as people have said, a war that's not yet finished. In fact, I was just reading the other day, a think tank in Jerusalem, very closely associated, big contacts with the Israeli military, said Israel and Iran are now actively preparing for the next phase of war. So the war is not over, it's going to come back again. And as we have seen in history, with war comes the conditions, the preconditions for revolution. And I hope the Kurdish revolutionaries meet the third condition and are successful in the Iranian-occupied part of Kurdistan.